Stanford University.
Today's session is on the race for technological supremacy, emerging technologies, and global implications. I'll start by letting the panelists introduce themselves. Matt, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm Matt Sheehan. I grew up in Palo Alto, primarily went to Stanford, but since graduating back in 2010, I've largely worked on US-China issues and now most recently on US-China technology. So I lived in China 2010 to 2016. I came back, I wrote a book about China-California sort of cooperation and competition called The Trans-Pacific Experiment. And then since publishing that book, I've really dove into the technology aspect of that. So I primarily focus on US-China competition and interaction in artificial intelligence. I work at a think tank, Paulson Institute.
Graham, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Graham Webster. I'm a researcher at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford and in the Cyber Policy Center. I lead a project called DigiChina, which studies Chinese tech policy. We do a lot of translating and trying to explain various Chinese tech, especially digital, but other technologies as well. By way of background, I started as a journalist and have lived in China a couple of times, did a whole kind of arc where I began as a general sort of tech in China journalist and then came back for grad school and ended up doing kind of comprehensive US-China relations for a few years, all kinds of issues, economic, military, et cetera. And then about 3-4 years ago, I got back to my interest in tech and politics, and we started building this project. So that's for those of you who are quote unquote on campus, feel free to be in touch. We like to work with other folks who are around.
And last but not least, Ziyang, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ziyang David Fan. I'm the head of digital trade, the World Economic Forum, Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We're based in the Presidio on the northern end of San Francisco. And I also teach a course called Technology Policy at the Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. I'm a lawyer by training, also has a China background, just like the two other panelists. So I worked at a law firm and the US government on trade, and also before I joined the forum, I helped Airbnb to enter China.
I think, Ziyang, from your work with the World Economic Forum, and I know you're not supposed to represent them on this panel.
Strictly personal capacity, yeah.
At a high level, how do you think society will change due to new emerging technologies we're seeing? I know that one of the forum's focus is of course, the fourth industrial revolution. And could you talk a little bit more about how these new technologies will shape and change society?
Yeah, just very quickly. You know, what we do here at the forum, and it's something I really believe in as well, is that new emerging technologies, right? AI, blockchain, 5G, just name your pick. Technology is moving too fast for policy and regulations. And there's a big gap in between. And that's the case all over the world. And it doesn't matter, it's the US and China, it's Ghana, it's Argentina. And that's a challenge that is both the private sector and the public sectors face, right? And why do I mean by that is that at least in 3 aspects, right? In the speed, the scope, and the skills. Technologies are changing too fast. And just give some quick examples, right? I think speed, I think you mentioned we have a current chess champion here, right? We all know how the IBM machine, Deep Blue beat the world chess champion back in 97, right? The Russian champion. And then fast forward to 2016 was when AlphaGo beat the world's Go champion. And that's a huge leap, right? From beating chess, which is by brutal computation, to beating the Go champion. And now in the years since, AI can now beat the best StarCraft players in the world. So I think it's just one quick example to show how the speed of technology. And what I mean by scope is that it's not just a digital will stay in the digital realm. However, the digital, physical, and biological are fusing. I think we have some engineering or medical students here will know how CRISPR and implications on society. And lastly, scale. Industries technology don't just stay in one neat bunch. I work in digital trade. However, I have a project on 3D printing because I'm looking at the impact of 3D printing on manufacturing and on global trade and on energy consumption, right? All those are related. So those are just some 3 really quick examples and aspects to show that technology is moving really fast, and same time, policies, regulations, and our societal norms are not keeping up. And a lot of things that we'll be discussing today, and I know when personally, for example, the privacy issues, et cetera, are examples of that gap. And I think we really need both the public and private sector, not just the tech folks. And when I'm talking about the private sector, it's really all the different stakeholders to get together and find a solution for it. And that's what we do, and that's at least what I do on a daily basis.
And question for any of the panelists is, we're hearing so much priority focused on AI, robotics, 5G, a lot of these emerging technologies become a national priority for a number of countries. Why is ramping up research and development funding on these emerging technologies important for countries in the first place?
Okay, yeah, I'll give it a shot. I think Matt probably has some useful things to say about this. He's done some great research looking at the national efforts in China and comparing, especially in AI fields, what the two countries, the economies have to offer. But I'll say, as a sort of, economic and national security policy priority, especially when it comes to the United States and China, there's a sense that there is an advantage to be had economically and in terms of national security in being having within your country networks of innovators, meaning from primary research to implementing and marketing on new technologies that aren't widely deployed. And there are a bunch of reasons that you can understand why. There's a lot of money to be made. If 5G is the great example, if Huawei is really building the kit that is for the world in terms of performance, then that's a lot of money to be made. And they end up setting a lot of standards and even have a lot of licensing fees to collect. And that only runs up against national security concerns. But in other fields, it's just a similar logic. If your clusters of companies and universities and other researchers and national supported experimental zones, for instance, allow companies within your country to become leaders in automated AVs or other things that need a whole build out in part of a city, for instance, it can just be a huge advantage. And the last thing I'll say is that there is a national security element to the extent that there are both vulnerabilities and capabilities that come with advanced technologies. Getting ahead can be, frankly, a weakness and a strength, but national security organizations in many countries are interested in making sure that they're resilient to attacks of various kinds that would be fueled by automated technologies, and that they are using automation in ways that reduce cost and risk to service members in an armed conflict, not to mention the whole sort of back and forth of using machine learning in cybersecurity, offensive and defensive operations. There's a need to have, if you're going to run a big economy and a big national security operation, there's a need to have relatively leading resources that you can touch on. And if you're in a rivalry with one of the countries that has those resources, you might lose access to them. And that's what we've seen happen over the last couple of years with the US and China, primarily from the US side, cutting off Chinese companies from key supplies and imperiling their high-tech operations. But that can go in the other direction and in many other directions with other countries.
Matt, what are your thoughts, particularly having written extensively on the topic, including a book about how China and California both collaborate and compete for our future?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll focus on one slice of it, which is just one that happens to be like top of mind right now for me, which is specifically, why do governments actually need to get involved in this process? I think most people agreed that like the internet was a transformative technology and the US gained a lot from being a first mover in like building large digital platforms. But if we can, from maybe the late 1980s onward, from when the internet got commercialized up through the present day, more or less, that was primarily funded and developed in the private sector. The very early roots were very much out of US government funding from like the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project, something A. And so I guess, yeah, my focus would be on why does the government need to get involved? And I think throughout the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, a lot of us got lulled into a belief that drinking our own Kool-Aid on just how powerful the private sector is, and just the fact that we need to leave Silicon Valley, we need to leave technologists entirely alone, and that not interfering, not funding, not distorting the market is a crucial ingredient. Freedom is like the most important ingredient to flourishing in technology. And I think a lot of what the last 10 years have been is a slow undermining of that assumption, and the slow realization dawning on us that actually the US government specifically for technologies like AI and 5G, the US government kind of needs to play a very active role. I think maybe half of that realization came just watching how China has developed over the last couple decades and recognizing that concrete government initiatives to expand STEM education, to deploy AI across the economy, to have the government invest, subsidize AI companies, subsidize AI talent to return from overseas, and be a large customer of AI technology, especially surveillance technology, recognizing that was one way that China caught up rather quickly, that the government played a pretty substantial role in that. And I think it's conjured up a little bit of insecurity on the US side, some of which is maybe overblown, rampant fear that China's going to overtake us any day. But the other part of it is just realistic, that for a technology like the internet, the vast number of commercial applications really do not need public money involved in it. A company like Uber, a company like Airbnb, a company like Google it's just information. It's largely information passing back and forth. And this is something that's primed for funding by venture capital. But for a lot of the more socially impactful applications of AI, especially the ones that touch on national security, like what Graham was referring to, they need government support. If you're going to, for example, roll out a sort of a fully autonomous vehicle fleet throughout society, the government at the very least needs to be very involved in the regulatory side of that. And in some cases, the government might need to revamp public infrastructure, to whether that's putting sensors in the road or just designing sort of street signage and whatnot so that it's more sort of machine readable and stuff like that. And I'm in this US government involvement headspace right now because I just finished reading this very long report from the National Security Commission on AI, an independent US government body. And I'd say the biggest kind of takeaway from that, a group that's sort of co-chaired by Eric Schmidt and by leading people from DOD and elsewhere, the biggest takeaway they had is that the US government just needs to get much more involved in technology development and technology strategy domestically, not 5-year plans and state takeovers of private companies or something like that, but guidance, sort of subsidies, really doubling down on funding of cutting edge research and a whole bunch of other mechanisms. So I think, that change in both the US position vis-a-vis China and that change in what the technology itself does and can do are the two reasons why we're seeing governments kind of step back onto the technology stage in a way that sometimes they haven't since the Cold War era.
I'm glad you mentioned that report, since I have a few questions related to that later today. But first, I think a lot of people will compare the approach of the United States to be different from that of China, which is then different from that of Europe and that of other countries. Would love for one of you to elaborate just at a very high level how these different approaches differ and what it might mean for the pace of R&D development and the pace of development of these emerging technologies over the next few years.
I can take a crack at it. But first, I just want to follow up on what Matt said, and I totally agree on policymaking aspect of it. We work closely with the private sector, and I personally hear a lot from the private sector folks that it's interesting, right? If you ask them 5-10 years ago, especially the tech folks, I think some of them will say, we are just a tech company. We're just a platform. We're just a software company. We don't get involved in policymaking, or we don't need help, or we're fine. Just let us be. But things have definitely changed in the past 10 years, and particularly in the 5 years, right? And I think even now some of the tech companies publicly say that we want good regulation. And I think some of the CEO has stated that in public, we want good regulation. And maybe they're feeling more pressure, right? So they want more clear guidance and rules. But also that in many ways, technology can only go so far without reforming the policy and the governance space. For example, to give a concrete example, in trade, standardization of, for example, of data is a major issue. Harmonization of different countries, different region state standards. And that's an issue that, private sector can push, but definitely we need public sector and good policy support. And to answer your question, I think if we look at, this is a huge generalization, so I'll make this disclaimer like this big. If you look at US and China, huge generalization, I'll say the US is more market driven. You can call it a value driven, and China may be more government or state driven. A lot of exceptions on that, but I think Generally speaking, the U.S. take this, taking privacy as example, right? I don't have a federal privacy law. California has a state one, but generally things are okay unless you do something wrong, then FTC comes and slap your hand. Whereas you obviously with the GDPR. Yeah, so I think there's a high level. I think those are some of the distinctions. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions to that, and of course that also creates, generally speaking, different attitudes and ecosystem within each country, which I can elaborate more, but I'll pass over to other panelists for now.
Any other thoughts on those differences, Matt?
Yeah, one quick thought on the Europe side of it. I think just a few years ago, everyone's very focused, obviously, on the US-China dynamic of this. And those are the two countries that are putting out the strongest companies and in many ways producing like the top tier research. I think just a few years ago, there was a real kind of, at least in the US, there was a real rolling of eyes at the idea that Europe could become a major player in AI through sort of government regulation in a lot of ways. But I think, yeah, again, in this time period, sort of 2015 to 2020, Europe has proven that when you have a market that large and you're willing to set draconian rules or obligations on tech companies, they really will come to heel for you. They will amend their content moderation policies. They will amend their data privacy policies with GDPR. So just as a comment, because I think many in the US and me sometimes in the past have felt this kind of, like Europe just can't really produce the technology, but wants to govern everybody's technology. But I think my perception on that front has shifted substantially, that I think that kind of Ziyang referred to it as a value-driven approach. I think I just tweak it slightly to say like a regulatory-driven approach, but regulations driven by values. Yeah, I think it's more powerful than we had imagined in past years.
And do any of you think there is a first mover advantage to being the first in terms of being an AI leader or a 5G leader or a robotics leader? Is there a first mover advantage? And are countries like Europe, who might be considered falling behind on the development of these technologies, at a significant disadvantage?
So maybe I'll take that first. And I promised to, when we were talking before, I promised to challenge a little bit the frame of AI or whatever type of tech supremacy. And I think that it's useful to disaggregate a little bit the notion of leadership. And I think there's definitely first mover advantage for firms. There's first mover advantage for sort of networks of people who develop the primary research and then market it and then deploy it. But you really have to look technology by technology. And the first mover advantage is somewhat less on things that are really primary research that simply get published in public papers and then can be implemented around the world. And then maybe you don't have the first mover advantage when you've come up with the new machine learning algorithm until somebody else comes up with the chip that runs it at great efficiency. It's going to be a networked type of advantage. And I think rarely we will find broad areas of technology where a national advantage or supremacy is a reasonable way to look at it. I think that unless, frankly, the US and China and some other countries, but primarily them and maybe India, continue the process of trying to wall themselves off from one another technologically, if we go further down that road, there might be more of a kind of distinct, mutually exclusive set of tech ecosystems where some things will be broadly more advanced in one place than in another. At the moment, we're still fairly interlinked, and most advantages that you would accrue to a Chinese firm or a US firm are actually, frankly, going to be depending on inputs, whether in terms of intellectual property, labor, physical parts, or licensed IP from one another and from many other countries. So that's my kind of deny the premise of the question thing. But I will say, again, on military things, there's obviously technological supremacy when you're having a dogfight with fighter planes. There's some planes are going to be able to maneuver better. And if you have unmanned vehicles that are able to maneuver at g-forces that are not survivable by humans flying airplanes, then they're going to be better at shooting down fighter jets. And so they're in really state-to-state competitive frames like military conflict, it is more reasonable to talk about supremacy or dominance or advantage than others. I tend to find it to be distracting from the policy challenges that should be pursued, which includes some of the things we've been talking about. Both Ziyang and Matt, mentioned different approaches. I think that there are different policy challenges in each country, and they all have to do with solving conflicts of power relations between sectors of society or parts of the government, and their relations with various firms and industries, and foreign and domestic. So it ends up being, like all of our supply chains, very networked in terms of who's actually winning.
We've started to talk a little bit today about approaches by different countries, and there is some need to explore technology through this military lens. The next question I have is around some conversations that have occurred where some have proposed that the US establish an emerging technology coalition with allies, and just thinking about, should countries be working together? How should the US work with allies and partners? And I ask this question not because the idea of AI-enabled warfare is the first move that anyone wants to do, but whenever there's new technology, it almost always comes with some sort of pursuit of power, and countries might be forced into the prospect of AI-enabled warfare just based on choices made by their strategic competitors. And how should we think about exploring AI through that military lens? Concepts like AI-enabled autonomous operations, how should we think about countries working together? And we can start with just the US being one example of how the US should work with its allies and partners.
In my heart, I'm always with Graham on the interconnections, the networks and stuff like that, but I've learned to speak through a little more zero-sum competition game. In terms of kind of you had two parts of that, the coalition question, how should we work together in coalitions, and also the kind of AI in warfare question. I think at least at this point, those are like different initiatives. I think the US is very focused on building out sort of coalition partners, but I think that's primarily for the purpose of shaping the marketplace, shaping the values around how technology is deployed, and making more countries likely to end up coming on board with, say, a broad like US European set of technologies. One example of it, a lot of this attention gets deflected to Southeast Asia and South Asia, and say this is a major sort of competition ground for the US and China, in whether it's like platform apps, TikTok versus YouTube or whatever, the Instagram, whatever that competition is. And I think there's a sense in the US that if we don't put up barriers or incentives for countries to largely adopt the US technology stack as opposed to the Chinese technology stack, a lot of those countries are going to end up sliding into sort of the Chinese camp, because China tends to be, through something like a Belt and Road Initiative or through like broader infrastructure projects down there, they see a major sort of strategic advantage in having, say, Huawei build out the 5G networks in places like that. In Europe too, but I think we feel a little more secure in Europe. So I think a lot of we're worried about that in the US from a market share standpoint, saying we want our technology companies to be the one that are profiting off 1 billion new people coming online and shopping. But the way that I think a lot of times bring on Europe and get into this kind of coalition mindset is by putting that like values layer over the top. Say, if you buy, say, a smart city package from Alibaba, which is something that Alibaba does market around the world. If you buy that smart city package, at the end of the day, that's going to, say, bolster potentially like anti-democratic forces within societies, maybe throughout Southeast Asia. And we want to have an intervention to stop that. And this is where I think we're finding some common ground with Europe. I think when it comes to the kind of the more tactical aspects of the US just saying, hey, we need to beat China in a market sense or in a technology sense. Hey, Europe, jump on board with us on this. I think they're a lot more hesitant than we might believe. The one area, Europe has big issues with US technology companies, and they're constantly taking US companies to task for this. And so I think the US in many ways wants to use the values-driven lens, holding up China as a paragon of a kind of totalitarian surveillance state, using that as a lens to get Europe and maybe some other Europe, Japan, South Korea, and then India is usually like the more developing country that's usually thrown in the mix. We want to use that values-driven coalition lens as a way to keep China out of more foreign markets. That's a slightly more cynical approach. There are genuine, like very real concerns here, but I do see a convenient sort of intersection between those values-driven approaches and what we just want from a competitive standpoint.
I do want to talk about the misinformation campaigns that have deployed fake content on social networks that have then been used to influence democratic elections in the US and Europe, and just the whole idea of the increased use of AI by foreign powers to spread disinformation online and launch cyber attacks. What should we be doing to guard against these threats? Is this an approach that we need the private sector to be taking an active role in, or should we be leaving it up to policy? Maybe Ziyang, I'll throw that question over to you.
Yeah, the forum is the organization for public and private partnerships. So I'll definitely advocate for that, for the two sides to work together. Just on that, I think obviously is a tremendously serious question. And there are tech solutions and there are policy solutions. And ideally is that we can do both and combine both solutions. I personally think that's the only way we can address this serious issue. I think what's interesting to know and to look at this issue is that how from the both sides, right, from the tech company side and the policy side, they're trying to move things forward. How Facebook will have, you probably heard this Supreme Court of Facebook, which I think is definitely a step in the right direction, but also raises a lot of questions. And folks are asking questions like, who gets to sit on this court? A Supreme Court, and what if you disagree with that decision? And can we allow a company to make that kind of decision? Some folks argue it should be more like a appellate court instead of a Supreme Court. So I think maybe we'll take one step back. Having worked in both the public and private sector, I think we absolutely need more folks in the government to be more tech savvy and more folks in the tech sector to be mindful of policy implications. I think a lot of the mess that we are in today is because there's lack of both people on both sides. And for example, maybe some folks on the tech side just didn't think too far, or didn't think in a very comprehensive way of how this technology will lead to certain impacts and implications, or maybe focused too much a bit just on the tech side of things, which is maybe not to their fault at all, given their responsibility as engineer coders, etc. So I think it's this awareness building the tech side and the knowledge building on the policy side. So the more familiarity, understanding of how technology works, and not just either past knee-jerk reactions, knee-jerk policies, or just ignore it altogether. I think that's really the way we can move forward.
I'm curious if others have thoughts on this. And part of the reason why I also asked this question around guarding against these sorts of AI threats is I think for the first time, we're seeing AI attacks that are being based not because most traditional cyber attacks are usually because there's bugs or loopholes or some sort of human mistakes in the code, but these AI attacks that we've seen more recently, it's just based on inherent limitations in the algorithms that currently cannot be fixed. So just very curious on your thoughts in terms of what should we be doing to guard against these sorts of threats?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. And part of it, I think to some extent, it helps illuminate some of the challenges in something like a US, Europe, and maybe others tech alliance of democracies, because there's a fundamental disconnect in terms of how you would handle disinformation or sort of algorithmic manipulation in a European regulatory framework versus in an American framework. And it's possible the United States will later have a national privacy framework or law. It's possible that it's Tim Wu is going into the White House and Lina Khan is being nominated for the FTC. It's the antitrust, anti-tech antitrust forces are gathering in Washington. And I think that portends some fairly significant changes that may need to happen in various companies. But for now, there isn't alignment because in the US framework, it's a little bit whack-a-mole. It's holy shit, the Russians might have tipped the election using various means, including Cambridge Analytica and data. Maybe, we don't know, but wow. And then let's all panic about this for 4 years and then see if we can't get everyone worked up about not having the election be messed up. And then the postmortem on that is the jury's out. There've been some good events from our Cyber Policy Center colleagues looking at that, and a lot of my colleagues were working very hard on day-to-day monitoring disinformation, but it's basically a laissez-faire solution. Wait for harm to rear its head, and then use power relationships to essentially try to force the harm to go away. But that doesn't help for countries that don't have that much power over the American tech giants or the Chinese tech giants whose services they may be using. It may not be a super popular opinion around Silicon Valley, as that's what I've found so far, but I think there's a real dilemma to be wrestled with around the business model of companies that operate in the information space. And it's well summed up in the long argument by Shoshana Zuboff about surveillance capitalism and how essentially the business model of the various social media companies depends on selling persuasion and selling manipulation of the users to any bidder that is authorized. And I think there's a real argument to be made that's a little more European compatible and frankly a bit more Chinese digital economy compatible in terms of regulation, to say that this type of manipulation should not be something that you're selling. Find a different business model. So from the perspective of innovation and kind of business people and people who might be designing products, I think it would be really powerful if there was whether it's policy or industry led, I would probably be more successful if it was industry led to think about how to provide compelling products and services that do not depend on this particular type of manipulation for pay, which would essentially remove the kind of in one of the major avenues for intentional manipulation, right? There would still be accidental cascades and some model ends up shoving people over in the YouTube algorithm that gets people to watch the extremist content. That's just optimizing a product for engagement and keeping people involved, fine. But if there are ways to go about trying to build this risk out of the business model, I think that would be really powerful, and it would require serious new work, right? It wouldn't be continuous with the way that things are done right now at the big companies in Silicon Valley, and I hope people are working on it.
Yeah, the National Security Commission on AI and the report that Matt alluded to earlier does touch a little bit upon these misinformation campaigns. Specifically, to pull a quote from the report, it states that AI is deepening the threat posed by cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns that Russia, China, and others are using to infiltrate our society, steal our data, and interfere in our democracy. The limited uses of AI-enabled attacks to date represent the tip of the iceberg. So they define this as the tip of the iceberg. Question I have for all of you is, should we be setting policy to allow people to report any sort of irresponsible AI deployment, any sort of AI-enabled attack, or is that even possible to set some sort of policy to report that?
I don't know would be the short answer. There are not companies, but organizations out there that are basically trying to catalog incidents of either like malign uses of AI or unsafe, which I guess you could cross over into irresponsible deployments of AI, and basically build a sort of a catalog around these things. Especially when it comes to disinformation, this is going to be happening on a scope and a scale that I don't think can be manually countered or documented in that way. But I think the sort of the safety element of it is something that I spend a fair amount of time looking at. And this is not safety in regards to disinformation or misinformation. It's safety in regards to the brittleness, often use that term, brittleness of AI systems. And I think this is maybe what Ernestine was referring to earlier, where it's not a bug in the code or something like that, but adversarial attacks. I think one area we've been now almost a decade of rapid progress in sort of the performance of AI systems, and therefore wanting to basically throw these systems at more and more problems throughout society. So it started with kind of I was about to call them low stakes, but maybe with all this misinformation talk, it's not right to call advertising a low stakes game. But the low hanging fruit of the AI revolution or machine learning AI broadly speaking, was to basically optimize based on a data set, optimize recommendations based on a large training set. And so that kind of diffused throughout the technology companies first. And then we started applying it to financial markets and insurance markets. And again, there are consequences for that, but maybe a little bit more contained. And I think where we're headed next, and where a lot of the organizations who focus on like cataloging these incidents are focused, is on broad safety concerns from functionally AI misoptimizing or misfiring in the real world. And this is I'm like starting down this path. I'm like, oh no, we're gonna take way too long to try to like document this. Basically, what I think we have not put a sufficient attention into is looking at safety of AI systems for like mission critical deployment. There was a recent study from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown where they compared the performance of standard AI systems, the leading algorithms at certain tasks, with the sort of level of performance we require from the systems for running like autopilot on an airplane or something like that. And we've gotten, I think the result was that our AI systems are nowhere near the level of kind of verifiable safety critical performance that we require from like big real world systems, things that control real world items. And I think we're hopefully at this turning point where we're very excited about AI. It's going to change everything. It's going to transform everything, can be made better with it, et cetera, et cetera. Recognizing just how brittle these systems can be when they're deployed in the wild. A lot of the most dramatic improvements are happening in like laboratory testing against benchmarks. But if we were to deploy these in the next form is probably going to be autonomous vehicles on a broad scale. I think we haven't quite grappled with how brittle and how easy it is to break these systems. So I guess that's where I would be putting my attention right now when it comes to like irresponsible deployments.
That was a great question because I loved it. When I read the question, irresponsible AI deployment, definitely a couple of examples come to my mind. ProPublica published this article a couple of years ago about how some courts are using AI to help them to make sentencing decisions. So, right, so how many years should the defendant get? And because the system was obviously was built on historical data, and historical data discriminate against minorities. So the AI system, when they spit out a result, the sentencing result also end up discriminating against minorities. Whereas we have this known image of two people, similar type of offense, whereas one person, the Caucasian, get a lot less years than the African American defendant. Right? And also in the recent years, we've seen companies have used AI for hiring, HR. Right. Again, used based on historical data, either from that particular company or from just corporate, world generally. And the result is, you can imagine, the same type of discrimination issues. So obviously, we have all those challenges is met because in the wild, I love this. It's just very visual. But how do we deal with it? Do we establish an agency, a website or phone number you can call? You can say this is irresponsible AI. I need you, the government or someone, to do something about it. I don't know whether that's the best solution because that can lead to so many questions. How do you define irresponsible? Whose opinion? And even nowadays, we have, by the way, at the center we have a whole AI team. So we do a lot of work, which you can check on our website. But even just to come up with a general overall principle set of rules for AI ethics is still something in the making. So I think we definitely have a long way to go.
Graham, any additional thoughts on that topic?
I would just say I would put a plug in for some of the privacy-oriented rules that are made around data handling, personal information handling. I'm most familiar with the Chinese and European examples, but in each case, there are elements of consent and autonomy that are built in as values, and so that it's a violation to use personal data in automated decision making in a way that's outside of these sort of principles that are laid out in these regulatory systems. And I think that's a useful tool because it empowers enforcement agencies with something like the FTC could do it. We just don't have rules in the United States for this type of thing, where if you lay out some principles for how data should be handled, this is a great hook for regulatory schemes to essentially give themselves a way into the ethical or just use of machine learning, just because at this point, the machine learning is all heavily data-based. And if we get to instruction-based advanced AI, then we'll have to use another hook to get in. But I think that there are data protection authorities that you can report to in many jurisdictions around the world about some categories of abuses of automation. And I think that model could be extended across beyond personal information specifically and start thinking about how to ensure things are safe. But I wouldn't want regulatory structures to get too technology specific, because even with the best people trying to move back and forth between places like Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., you're not going to end up with an institution like Congress moving at a speed that is rational for handling what's coming down the line this month, let alone 5 years from now.
It's interesting, Graham, that you answer this question more from a data privacy approach, since I think some individuals will say that China will think about leveraging facial recognition technology to identify and repress its minority populations, or some people have criticized China for using AI to build a surveillance state, while from a US perspective, especially the report that just came out last week, there's the argument that the US needs to make sure it maintains its commitment to international humanitarian law and human rights and really focus on preserving rights and liberties when using AI. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts around if this is the two approaches that China and US might be taking, what this does mean for the larger battle of tech supremacy, which I know we already talked about is not really a term we like to use, and just in general, the commercial and national security advantages that come with it.
Can I just really quickly on the question of personal information regulation in China? It's absolutely right that the Chinese government is a highly intrusive surveillance organization, and that high-tech surveillance is used in service of the objectives, including the atrocities in Xinjiang that the US government and others have called a genocide. But there's a huge distinction to be made in terms of the way that private companies are being regulated in the way that they use personal data versus the expectation of privacy vis-a-vis the government, especially concerning security authorities. So there's some protection against misconduct by everyday authorities in China, but they're not well enforced. And national security powers and police powers are extremely broad and widely abused. However, increasingly companies like Tencent and Baidu and Alibaba and all the others are getting greater and greater scrutiny. There are more and more rules, many of them closely resembling GDPR and then moving ahead in terms of anticipating newer problems, especially in the Chinese context. There is regulation and it's real. So I think when people talk about privacy and governance in China around technology, you're missing part of the picture if you don't recognize the abuses and if you don't recognize the kind of basically increasingly competent regulation of the private sector when it comes to data, and of course in alignment with the Communist Party and the government's priorities. Never forget that, but the separation is crucial.
Thanks for pointing that out. Matt, do you have additional thoughts on that topic?
Sure. Maybe I'll just a little bit on the role of data in, say, competition between companies or states, whatever level you want to look at it. I think we've the pendulum, like so many things in our assessment of sort of US-China technological strengths and weaknesses, the pendulum has swung really far back and forth on how we think about data in these systems. So I think early on in 2016, 17, when a lot of people in the policy world and the business world are getting woke to the power of AI and deep learning, and the first thing you learn is that the more data is better at training the systems. So I think we started off with this very focused on data when talking about competition between companies or states and AI. And the general sort of takeaway was, oh, China has so many people and nobody cares about privacy. And so there's all the data is going to eat us all with all their massive data. I think the reaction to that, and an appropriate one from a lot of people who think seriously about this, was to really try to push back against that narrative and say data is just one piece of the ecosystem. It's a lot more complicated. It's not just about how many people are in your facial recognition database. There's a lot of other dimensions to that. I think we've pulled, there was an effort by many people, myself included to some extent, to just yank the narrative back over to, no, it's not so much about data. It's really about talent, it's about research talent, and it's about semiconductors. In reality, it's somewhere in the middle. I think denying that China benefits a lot from having large pools of data, and the government benefits from having access to that data via its like security organs. I think trying to deny that would be like foolish long term, but it's also not the deciding factor in US-China AI competition. I know that's a broad statement of it, but I've been noticing lately how much we've gone on these pendulum swings with how we think about Chinese technology. And I think data is one of those. And maybe just one plug for a way of thinking about how the US and Europe can compete more effectively, knowing that China has something akin to a data advantage. There's a really interesting paper also by the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET, in DC, and I believe it was called Shaping the Terrain of AI competition, something like that, had the word shaping the terrain in there. And the big picture sort of thesis was, if we acknowledge that China maybe has an advantage from its access to data. One way that we can mitigate that advantage long term and preserve privacy long term is to try to essentially push the field of AI into more privacy preserving directions. And I'll give two examples of that. One of them is what's called few-shot learning, which basically means being able to train an AI system on far fewer examples. It doesn't matter whether you have 5,000 or 5 million images in the database. You can train effectively on the smaller number. And another example that I believe I actually first heard from Graham drinking a beer on a sidewalk in Oakland somewhere was about federated learning, which is functionally a different method of approaching machine learning, where you do a certain amount of the computation needed for training an algorithm on the sort of the edge device, and not having to essentially put all of the data into sort of a centralized cloud or a server where the training is done. And in doing that, you've anonymized the data vis-a-vis the individual people in it. And so these are just two kind of technologies. Both of them are very nascent. They are not like widely used, but they are getting a lot of attention in the research community. And if the US and Europe, through essentially funding research in these areas, through having our companies adopt those techniques, is able to shift the broader field of machine learning in a privacy preserving direction, and a direction that minimizes the impact of data in that context, that would be a long-term shift that would take some advantage away from China in this competition, and just would take advantage away from big tech companies that might like to exploit this, whether at home or abroad. So I had some other point, but that's just about it, I think.
I do want to turn it over to some questions that popped up from the class. So the first question is, do you think the technological developments employed elsewhere in China will be adopted by the West? I'll let the student who asked that question also provide any additional comments.
Yeah, thank you all very much for today. I was in Xinjiang in 2018, and I had a Chinese driving license, so I was able to drive around. And what was the overwhelming feeling was, as I was pulled over many times and then interrogated in different control centers, was the vast levels of surveillance. And I think we briefly touched upon this. I wonder whether you see a day-to-day life in the West that replicates that level of surveillance. And I think you touched upon it, but I think I'm quite interested in the day-to-day norms of what I saw in Xinjiang, and whether that could ever foreseeably be replicated in the West.
So I can react first and see if others have something, because I've thought about this to a fairly deep degree from time to time for a couple of reasons. And so first of all, I think essentially, no, I don't think we're going, I don't think Oakland is turning into Xinjiang. We've banned facial recognition use by the government in the city of Oakland overall. It's the things are moving in the opposite direction. But the other thing to say about it is that because one of the ways that I think about it is the US and I think some others have moved to sanction some key Chinese surveillance technology companies, especially those that make facial recognition enabled cameras, over specifically for their involvement in the abuses in Xinjiang and for sort of enabling this. And as a policy question, I keep questioning, did this really accomplish anything? I don't really object to it from a perspective of, yes, these companies they do profit from this sector of their customer base, but is it helping the people at the receiving end of the human rights abuses? And my hypothesis would be that in large part, no, it's not, because the main policy, the main sort of driver of the brutality and the misery and the abuses is the Chinese government's policy decision to essentially try to eliminate the distinctiveness of Uyghurs and other Muslims, and to bring Xinjiang under control. And that decision is being pursued using available technologies, including facial recognition, which are not at all uniquely available from Chinese vendors, of course, American vendors, Israeli vendors, others around the world. And I went through enough of a deep learning Coursera to realize that if you have enough compute and much better skills than I do, that facial recognition isn't like a super hard problem anymore. I don't think it's coming for all of us, but I do think that capability is going to be much more widely distributed around the world. And so where you have governments that want to be that intrusive or that dominating, they will reach for this tool among others. But that's the question, is whether the brutality is being advanced. Because you could have a place like London, which is super highly surveilled, that with all there are real civil liberty problems in the UK, and the police and national security powers have been abused from time to time, according to people like me who are real privacy advocates. But it's not Xinjiang, but camera coverage is similar.
Another question from the class is, in this global race for tech supremacy, particularly US-China, is it an issue for the US that it knows less about what's going on in China than the reverse? If so, what can and should the US do about that? I'll let the student who asked that question provide any additional comments.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for your time. So I listed the question, and part of the reason why I did that was because from my time working in Silicon Valley and also in Beijing, I realized that especially a few years ago, everyone in China, they were studying how Google works, how Facebook works. I think they know a lot about what's going on in the US, whether it's in DC, New York, Silicon Valley. I think to the extent that I think a lot of people in China now feel like they've learned enough and they don't even have to learn about it anymore. Whereas I think in the US, I think a lot of people still don't, maybe other than the panelists here, still don't know too much about what's going on there. So I think maybe to the point of first mover advantage that you were talking about, I think many people in China are like in the tech field, they're able to just learn from what's going on in the US and then try to do even better. So I was wondering, like, what should be the US response to this whole information asymmetry?
I think, David, you obviously hit the nail on the head. There's a huge information asymmetry, and it's a huge problem. And I think that's a lot of what like Graham does at DigiChina is very much trying to fill in that gap with translation and analysis. A lot of what I do is trying to fill in that gap as well. I think in terms of like policy prescriptions, the government is doing a lot more embracing of open source intelligence, OSINT, which is something that the Chinese government tends to be very good at leveraging. And there I'm talking about the Chinese government, US government, I'm talking about the word, intelligence. So it sounds very much like a sort of a military matter, but I understand that what you're talking about is often just it's low key. It's people in Beijing reading whatever Wired or whatever is the like latest publication, whereas Americans in the similar sector not reading the same in Chinese. But I do think there's a lot of low hanging fruit in terms of open source intelligence, particularly in AI and AI research, because it is such a open by default field. People, when papers are written, they're immediately published online at the site called Archive. And it makes it relatively easy to track the kind of trends in research developments, particularly much more than sort of private sector like business model trends. But yeah, it makes it easier. This is a lot of the work that I've done the past few years is looking at top tier researchers in the US and China and globally, and how do they move between different countries, and basing that entirely on totally open source online information. So I know that this is something that, China has been very good at for a while. And I think the US government is especially pushing on it now. The just appointed as the deputy of OSTP, the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, is a guy named Jason Matheny, who's a huge advocate of leveraging this type of open source intelligence for government decision making. But yeah, that's not the same as just having every entrepreneur in China know what's going on in the valley and having Americans only catching like tiny little tidbits that come out of China periodically.
Yeah, if I just 2 quick points. One, so David, exactly, I think everything says very much true. At the same time, in certain industries, for example, in e-commerce and in fintech, I think the so-called Silicon Valley is also looking at China for some inspirations. For example, on digital payments, definitely see that how social media have been trying to roll payments into its whole ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. And two, I think to really address that problem, it starts with you, all of you. I read this report recently saying that I think the number of Americans, university students are studying about China or on China, China-related topics, the number went down quite a bit. So it's actually alarming because US and China relationship is entering such an intricate period where at the same time, students are studying this are going down. So that's a major issue. So the fact that all of you here, and maybe after this talk, you think inspired to now or later to go deeper on this topic, I think that's really start with all of you.
I would just add very briefly that I of course very much believe that people need to pay more attention to China, and governments and businesses should support programs like mine and the projects that Matt works on, and et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that we also get trapped a little bit sometimes, even the people who are trying to look at tech issues across borders and pay attention to China and Europe and maybe India. And then that's usually it. And so there's the rest of the world out there. And I just think it's crucial, I think, both for business reasons, for governance reasons, human rights reasons, that starting in universities and people who are students and have the opportunity to learn more languages or to intentionally study a context that is not one of the ones that is flush with funding. We just need as much of that as possible. And exchanges are hard to do, especially right now when we can't travel. But a plug for the rest of the world, no joke.
The final question is related to, Graham, your point on people need to pay more attention to China, but also Europe, India, other parts of the world. So the question is, do you think America presents a technological threat to the rest of the world, or should China be our only major concern? And who asked that question?
Yeah, this was me. I think there was a slightly egregious question that was, do you think Russia presents a technological threat to the US, or China should be our only major concern? So I think I was just trying to combat this American exceptionalism and centrism. So slightly tongue in cheek, but it'd be interesting to take your thoughts on that.
I think I take that tongue-in-cheek question seriously, and because I think a lot of people in other countries take it seriously. It was interesting watching the sort of fallout when Twitter and Facebook and everyone banned Trump after the Capitol riots. Some of the people who, in terms of world leaders, the people who spoke out the most firmly against it were European leaders who have no love for Trump whatsoever, and also have themselves been very hard on US companies about content moderation and saying you've got to take a harder line on stopping extremism and inflammatory content online. But I think those people in other countries, when they see the US technology companies blocking a current US president from their platforms, they look at their own like digital mortality in the mirror. I think it makes them very deeply uncomfortable, the idea that a US company can fundamentally decide what happens in terms of speech in countries all around the world. And that's Europe probably still has a lot of like insulation on this front because they have a regulatory apparatus that can do real damage and exact real sort of costs on the US tech companies. But historically, if you were a country like Thailand and you had a high national priority, government priority or social priority content moderation issue or technology issue, the chances that you'd be able to elevate that and have it taken like the same degree of seriousness that it would if it emerged out of the US and Europe is very small. I think countries around the world are slowly realizing they have more leverage than imagined. China pioneers this by blocking the tech companies and just saying, no, screw you. We're just going to hold the line. And I think a lot of countries have slowly learned that actually the big US juggernauts are more prone to intimidation at losing markets than we thought maybe 10 years ago. But still, if you're a country or a leader in a country anywhere else in the world, you do feel like your sort of digital ecosystem is fundamentally in the hands of a very small group of Americans.
I agree with Matt, but I would also add that I just thought of another way to look at it is Facebook can be a threat to regime stability in the United States and in other countries, and a threat to privacy all at the same time. And when we talk about what the technological risks and menaces are, some of them are American patterns and American companies that perhaps could be more effectively regulated in this country. But sometimes it's the companies. Some do a better job than others in being responsive. And I'm picking on Facebook because they're the most prominent one. So if there's going to be a problem, they're going to be involved in it. And I know that a lot of people there are working hard on various things. But yeah, so at some point, I agree with Matt that some more governments are finding levers to hold these companies accountable. And I think that's a good development.
And just quickly, there's a term called the Silicon States, and saying that the tech companies are having more and more influence and power. They reach billions of people. It was interesting, a couple of years ago, Denmark started this program or this position called a tech ambassador. So basically just the same level as ambassador in DC, but it's actually based here in Silicon Valley. And because a lot of the issues that in the influence they say we'll have ambassador to Thailand, why not to here? And the companies that actually have in a way can have huge impact on both their citizens and the world.